Thank you so much to everyone who's also joining us this evening. I'm the co-executive director of the Serica Initiative, which is a New York-based nonprofit that galvanizes a global community of changemakers to advocate for greater Asian American inclusion, as well as advance positive social impact in US-China relations through dialogue, storytelling, and our convening power. In the wake of the tragic Atlanta spa shootings in 2021, we approached exploring hate with the idea for a film series about Asian Americans and the spat of hate crimes that continue to affect our community. That would be a digital companion to Gina Kim's full-length documentary to commemorate that day, Rising Against Asian Hate, one day in March. Over the course of 9 months, we shot and produced a 5-episode series called Belonging Asian Americans Now, which profiles Asian American trailblazers from across the country in 5 stories of belonging and exclusion, resilience and hope, and solidarity in the face of hate, including Pulitzer Prize-winning novelist Viet Thanh Nguyen and renowned actor George Takei. We couldn't be more grateful and proud that our second season of collaboration between Black and White Asian American Speak Out is now live and streaming. So before we begin, and I go ahead and introduce our panel tonight, I'd like to play a very short clip from that first episode that I think will help set the stage for the discussion this evening. So this first episode is called Bridging the Divide. It's about how the Black and the Asian American communities in one San Francisco neighborhood are working together to confront racism, fear, and misperceptions about one another. It's about 3 minutes long. So after that, we'll go ahead and introduce our distinguished panel.
I think 2010 is a pretty key period that happened within the Asian community, especially our elders in the Bayview district.
There was a lot of fear in the community. This video that went viral was this African-American woman, this Chinese woman was on the bus. They had an argument. There was another incident. A Chinese woman was standing on the platform, and then this one young person would push this woman into oncoming traffic.
A lot has been targeted or really finger pointing to the African American community, saying that they have been bullying the Asian community.
That's this phrase that was coined when they were talking about Asian Americans. They call us the walking ATMs. So what they're saying is like, hey, they got money. Those people got money. If you rob them, they would have cash. And it's like a walking ATM.
Eddie is someone who, like me, wants to see our communities come together and understand that we are better together versus being divided. Regardless of what narratives some people want to put out there about how we are as communities, sometimes people tend to want to blame whole races of people, whole communities, and that's the hard part about this work. I'm originally from Bayview Hunters Point, lived there early part of my years. Bayview Hunters Point is really the last place where you can find a good percentage of the Black population. It's about 20%. As most people probably know by now, we have less than 5% Black population here in San Francisco.
You see people who have called this place home when no one wanted to call this place home, when no one cared about this neighborhood, when the city wouldn't even recognize the need and the beauty in this community. Black people were here.
In the early 2000s, just a lot of immigrants, like Chinese immigrants, other immigrants, start moving into the Bayview.
It is very challenging. There's a language barrier. We can't communicate what's going on. And we do not know how to build bridges or reach out to them. So they felt like that we're a group of strangers coming in, that they feel like they're being displaced and they're being disrespected.
I've seen a lot that has happened. You can talk about it, you can cry about it, and we need to do those things, but what are we going to do to bridge the gap?
Thank you so much for that. Eddie says earlier in that episode, it's about how do we build trust between communities and how do we fight hate together. And tonight we've gathered an incredible group of panelists to discuss these very questions and more. In the interest of time, I won't go into their full bios, but you can find them in the link in the chat. But I'll go ahead and start with Paula Williams Madison is Chairman and CEO of Madison Media Management and 88 Madison Media Works, Inc. In 2011, Madison retired from NBC Universal, where she had been Executive Vice President for Diversity and held a number of successful leadership roles in her 22 years. She's also the author and executive producer, respectively, of the book and documentary Finding Samuel Lowe, which tells of her successful search to locate the Chinese grandfather's descendants in China. Hi, Paula, welcome. Next, I'd like to introduce Frank Wu, who serves as the 11th president of Queens College. Frank was also appointed to the Obama administration's National Advisory Committee on Institutional Quality and Integrity, which advises the administration on higher education accreditation, and he's also the author of Yellow, Race in America Beyond Black and White, as well as co-author of Race, Rights, and Reparation, Law and the Japanese American Internment. Thank you for being with us, Frank. And last but not least, I would like to introduce Jennifer Wu, no relation, who's the founding partner of Broombridge, Wu, Bauman, and Stone. She also has an active pro bono practice and represents a number of Asian American victims of racially motivated violence, as well as their families. Jennifer is the co-chair of the Asian American Bar Association of New York's Women's Committee and received the New York Law Journal's Diversity Initiative Award in 2022 in recognition of her pro bono work. Thank you all so very much for being with us this evening. I'd really love for this to be a conversation and bring in all of that, what's on your minds as well for those at home watching. So please do type in questions into the chat as we'll get going, and we'll make sure to get to them in the second half of the program. Likewise, I'll be asking questions of each of you, but if one of you wants to chime in and respond to something that someone else has said, please feel free to do that. So we'll kind of keep things as organic as we can. So I'd like to start with you, Frank. It seems, as the title of this series might suggest, we often see race really literally as black and white in this country. And you wrote the book. You literally wrote the book on this issue, Yellow, Race in America Beyond Black and White. So I want to ask you a little bit, where do Asian Americans fit into this equation historically? And since you've written that book 20 years ago, has the conversation shifted at all now?
Yeah, these are great questions. They're the questions that have been asked about Asian Americans since Asian immigrants first started arriving. And the answer is varied. It's dependent on where exactly, when exactly, different communities, the different dynamics, the politics of it, specific families. And there are many families that straddle the color line. There's Anglo-Asian and an Afro-Asian part of the family, right? So I think there are three things going on real quick. One is we tend to define race in literally black and white terms. So if you're neither, if you're ambiguous, if you're mixed, people just can't figure it out, you're just not part of the dialogue. People just don't understand how to process that. Second, the image of Asian Americans is the model minority. Super rich, super successful, no problems, which just generates its own prejudice and resentment because people are angry. You're all crazy rich Asians, and where did you come from, and why did you take over? And the third part is this perpetual foreigner syndrome. Even though they're Asian Americans who are sixth generation New Yorkers or Californians whose great-great-grandparents were here before the people teasing and taunting them had ancestors on these shores, there's a sense everyone's fresh off the boat. By the way, there's nothing wrong with being fresh off the boat. That phrase has been reappropriated thanks to a hit TV show. But these phenomena all come together to suggest Asian Americans they're not part of the dialogue. And so the very first thing we've had to establish is that we're people. We're Americans. We have a right to be here. We're equals, and we suffer the same way other people suffer. We're not somehow super rich or recent arrivals. So that's just sort of the threshold. And then once you get past that, then there are all the normal difficulties of reaching out and building bridges.
Thank you, Frank. Yeah, and I think some of that misunderstanding probably results in the discrimination and the heightened sense of violence that we're seeing facing the Asian American community. So I want to turn things over to you a little bit, Jennifer. We hear a lot, of course, about hate crimes that are being committed. Oftentimes it feels like every week or even every day. And I don't think it's an exaggeration to say that the media tends to highlight or hype up interracial tension as part of that narrative. Do you think that this is founded? Is the reality on the ground, based on the victims that you represent and their families, does it kind of fit this narrative, or to what extent are we getting the whole story?
Yeah, I don't think that hate crimes are perpetrated by one particular class of people. I think the media certainly seizes on that. And I think that there is a real tension, especially in New York City, between the people who are saying bail reform is the reason we have hate crimes against Asians. And on the flip side, people saying, well, bail reform was needed in order to decriminalize, behavior that wasn't really criminal. And I think that driving a wedge between Asians and, I would say, the Black community is not new, right? The whole term model minority was coined in order to say that, here's a class of people who can succeed. And if Black Americans can't succeed, then it's their problem and not our problem. And so I think that this is a historical artifact of kind of rising to who's the best minority. But fundamentally, for the victims I represent, and we represent nearly all of the New Yorkers who are Asian American who've died in New York City, pro bono, I'm not sure that they're concerned necessarily with the race of the attacker as how to survive the attack. And I think you said something really important, Daniel, in the beginning, which is how do we trust our community? And what's missing for the victims is trust in the institutions that are here to protect us. And that includes law enforcement, whether it's the DA or the police. It includes the hospital. It includes people like myself who are asking whether the victims need help. It certainly includes the media. So I think the distrust that we see from the Asian American victims of hate in New York City is similar to the distrust that you see from any victim of color in New York City. And in fact, when I first started this work, the person who mentored me at my former law firm was Loretta Lynch, who worked with Black communities of color for, in Brooklyn especially, for huge amounts of time. And she said, the issues you're seeing, Jen, are not unique to the Asian community. Let me give you some advice on how to handle distrust and mistrust. So I actually see more parallels than sort of divisions. And I think that people are starting to see that. But what's required is reaching across kind of reaching across to talk to one another. What I don't see is people talking about what's similar. I see people complaining about differences. And I think that might just be a New Yorker thing, but it's not helpful or constructive.
I appreciate that, Jennifer. And that's come up a lot in some of the discussions that we've had around this series, is that I think people are really quick to heighten the differences between us as individuals, and very few are willing to really point out the commonalities and kind of celebrate and kind of make that the focal point, as opposed to sort of what are the things that disparage our communities or tearing them apart. I love what you said too about trust. I think there's sort of trust between individuals, those sort of relationships, but you also need to have trust with those institutions, again, as you said, that are meant to keep us safe. And if we're lacking that as well, it's going to be hard to continue to push forward.
I just mentioned one more thing, which is it is true that for all of the victims who I've represented, the race of the people who are prosecuting the crime is an important fact for them. There's a belief that if the prosecutor is not Asian, or if the jury is not Asian, or kind of the lawyer who is the assistant district attorney is not Asian, they will not get justice. And particularly for recent immigrants from China, they often ask me, the first question is, how much are you going to pay the judge to find in our favor? Because that is the system where they come from. And when they hear that the judge is white or Black, or, it's never been Asian in my experience, they have concern that they won't be treated fairly, or in Frank's words, they won't be treated as human. And they ask me how it is that I'm going to be heard if they look Asian. And so there's an insecurity there of saying that America only gives justice to people who are white and Black. There is no justice for people who are in between.
Thank you, Jennifer. I think that's a really interesting point that I think I would love to explore a little bit more as well. And I want to turn to you, Paula, actually, to think too, obviously having worked in media for such a huge part of your career, thinking about, why do you think that there is this, predilection from media to kind of heighten these narratives, or kind of increase tension between different groups, instead of perhaps, as we've been discussing, maybe highlighting the commonalities or the similarities? What do you think is missing from that narrative? And can you speak a little bit to some of the history of activism between these groups and communities?
Sure. Thanks for having me. So I think it's important that among the first words out of my mouth are that I am a native of Harlem, born and raised there, daughter of Jamaican immigrants. My mother was Chinese Jamaican. My grandfather came from Guangdong province, where most of the Chinese in this country come from. I live in Los Angeles now, so I've kind of seen a view from two coasts. I want to, first of all, address the definition of model minority, and I've always taken it a slightly different, or expanded it a bit more than as my friend Frank has, which is that I think the other way that model minority has been described is sort of patting the Asian American community on the head. Aren't you good? Aren't you good because you're quiet? Aren't you good because you don't create issues? And I speak a lot to the Asian American community, particularly the Chinese American community and the African American community. But in regards to the Asian American community, what I try to say is the value of Confucianism, bend with the wind, stay quiet, don't make trouble, right? These are all values that are applauded and held high in certain parts of the world that are not applauded nor held high here in the United States. Mm-hmm. So being quiet, don't make trouble, bend with the wind, in this country will get you bullied, right? I frequently ask my Chinese brothers and sisters, do you understand that the difference in calling you a model minority versus the minority that no one wants to be, which is Black, right? Once we do that, then what does this mean for behavior and how one is treated? So I will say often, I'm going to teach you how Black people do it, because there is value in understanding that if you sit quietly, even if you have achieved A's, A pluses, 4.5, even if you've achieved the academic levels and heights that your parents and grandparents want you to have, that matters not. Because if what you're not doing is willing to stand up for yourself in that academic environment called school or college or university, you're going to get your butt kicked most often. And here is an ugly statistic. The ugly statistic that I recall of about 3 years ago is that the number one demographic committing suicide in United States colleges and universities are the Asian American students, right? That is a damning statistic for this entire nation. The other thing I'd like to point out is that there is a major difference between the immigrants who came here 1840s, 1850s, 1900s, 1940s, 1950s, and the immigrants who are coming today. The immigrants who came in the past were considered solely to be workers, labor. That's all they were, wanted, labor, not academicians, not attorneys, not people who succeeded in the business world, but labor. And labor that as soon as the United States was done with that labor, we would love for you to leave. But many of them did not. The difference now that I will get to here is that some of those who stayed, where did they live? They did not live in white communities. They lived most often next to African Americans. And so there were groceries, right? In Jamaica, they're called Chinese shops, right? Their clientele, their customers were overwhelmingly African Americans, and they were afforded the opportunity to pay later, pay when you get paid, right? So there was a symbiotic relationship between those communities, which we are not necessarily seeing today, not in all instances. But what we had when we lived next to each other was the opportunity to get to know each other. In major cities like New York, like Los Angeles, we tend to be siloed. In New York, there is public transportation, which can more democratize the city. People are rubbing shoulders with middle class, poor, wealthy. In Los Angeles, never happens because you're in your car. And if you're taking public transportation, it's overwhelmingly because you can't afford to be in a car. I'm going to get to the point here. Those clips that were played were to make the point. What we saw were African Americans who were attacking Chinese or Chinese Americans. And as a former working journalist, and I used to be the vice president and news director of NBC4 there in New York, what I can tell you is that when another attack happens, if there is no video, if there are no pictures, frequently what will happen is the media, the news media will go into the files and pull out the video or the pictures of something similar that may have happened. Mm-hmm. So what we might see is the reporting of another attack. There might not have even been a description given of the attacker, but I can pretty much guarantee you that those clips that you played were played not just specifically in relation to those instances, but in something that happened in another city similar to this. This happened in New York. So the narrative is generated that Black people are the ones who are attacking Asian Americans, Chinese Americans. And I should have looked it up, but there was a report coming out of Michigan about 2 years ago, 3 years ago, that said the majority of the attackers in the anti-Asian hate crimes were actually white males. And that we saw a significant number of these crimes, particularly in New York and Los Angeles and San Francisco, being committed by mentally ill homeless. Inside the mentally ill homeless population, there is a huge overrepresentation of African Americans. So now when you start talking about Wuhan virus, right? You know, all of that stuff that we heard perpetrated during the previous presidential administration, it incited a lot of fear and almost a justification for why we should attack. So now that the targets are on the backs of many Asian Americans, including people in my family, right? Now that the targets are on the back, it's like, well, let's go get those. That's sport, that's fun. And what I'm saying here is that we have to remember that the largest, fastest growing demographic in the United States is mixed race. I refer to myself not only as African American and Chinese American and Hakka and Jamaican, I also refer to myself as Blasian because I am a member of a very large and growing group of Black Asians. Combine the word, it's a new word, hashtag Blasian. Look it up on social media and see just how many of us there are and how overrepresented we are in entertainment, in sports, in media, fashion. Blasians are here, and the bridge, how do we resolve this? It might come from the close contact, which can lead to romance, which can lead to making babies, which then can lead to me.
You know, to combine this, that study, by the way, it's by Janelle Wong of the University of Maryland. It's a great study. What she found, she looked at media versus reality, and the media images overwhelmingly depict Black attackers, Asian American victims, but the crime statistics are different. So I want to be very clear. The media images, if you believe them, would say that all or almost all the attackers are Black people. That is not true. Not true. It's the opposite. So the media images promote this one concept that is counterfactual, or another way to put it is false.
Lies.
Yes, that's a more blunt way to put it. And I think Paula has it exactly right. Asian cultures all have an adage. The Japanese saying is the best known. The nail that sticks up is pounded down. That's about deferring to your elders, about fidelity to tradition, not making a fuss, being quiet, fitting in. My parents always said, try harder, just try harder. And I agree, we should try harder, but trying harder when you're facing abuse just leads to more abuse because people realize you're not going to fight back. Compare the American adage, the squeaky wheel gets the grease. It's all about standing up and speaking out. We can't just put our heads down. And I'm asked all the time, when are you going to stand up against Black people? And I think to myself, all right, that this framing is all wrong. That's not going to be helpful. Every time we face an issue, you can make it worse, you can make it better. And if we frame this as Blacks versus Asians, that is not going to improve anyone's life. It's not going to help victims of crime. It's not going to achieve justice. It's just going to get people even more riled up. So separate from ideals and principles, if you just want to talk practical politics, the way to do this is to embrace American ideals, the civil rights movement, coalition building, and Asian American itself is a coalition. There are no Asians in Asia, and our ancestors we're fighting total wars against each other. But in America, we come together, and that's unique to America.
So I just want to comment from the victim's point of view. I certainly have heard people in Chinatown say the answer to anti-Asian hate is to draw a circle around Chinatown and not let Black people in. That is certainly something I've heard from inside the Chinese community. And I think this speaks to the fact that, while I'm Asian American, I was born here. My first language is not actually English. I was raised in an environment where my voice was heard. And when you're dealing with Asian American victims of crimes who are particularly recent immigrants in the last 10 years, and they are not documented, they exist in the corners of society, and they have not been treated with respect. Most of them don't pay taxes, for example. They're scared the police will deport them. It's very difficult to speak out because they feel very alone already. They don't know who to trust. And so I very much appreciate what Paula and Frank are saying, that someone like me can come here and say, speak out, fight for justice, civil rights matter. But when you come as a new immigrant who you don't think any rights matter, you've probably paid a snakehead to let you in, you're probably owing a lot of money. This idea that you have to speak out is very challenging. And where I see the need, and this is important, is that when Asians are attacked, we don't always see people who are not Asian supporting them. When you go to the press conferences, and I've spoken at repeated press conferences about this, I've called for the arrest of people that have led to the arrest of people who are suspects in anti-Asian attacks. We don't always see necessarily Black lawyers coming to support us, other than kind of events I've organized where we certainly have Loretta Lynch and others. We do see the Jewish community come support us because they've certainly been victims of hate crimes. But in order to coalition build, I think we need to do more than say that the victim needs to stand up for their rights. That is not something that I see as a singular solution. Education is certainly another part of it. And then the second point I want to make is that there's a lot of frustration within the Asian community of the victims that I help, that the focus is on who the perpetrator is. Our entire criminal justice system is conditioned in the first phase of trial to focus on defendants' rights. It's all about the defendant being presumed not guilty. And that means that the perpetrator, whether they're Black or white or something else, is being given the benefit of the doubt. They're sometimes given bail, right? And there's a lot of kind of angst about that because the community feels unsafe. The person feels unsafe. And the reason that they're not speaking out, the reason they don't want to be in the newspaper, the reason they're hiding their head from the media is they are actually worried that the defendant's family will come after them. And so that was true with one of the victims I represented who was punched 125 times in Yonkers in her own home. She was a single mother who raised her daughters there. One of the daughters is a healthcare worker, for example, and she was punched 125 times in her own home. And she's never had her name made public. Her image is not being made public other than that horrifying video. And I actually spoke at the sentencing hearing for her family because she did not want her image to be public because she was worried defendant's family, who she knew, was going to come after her. So I don't want to minimize sort of the idea that we need to speak out and fight for our civil rights. But I also think that when you're a victim of a violent crime, it's a lot to ask, particularly if you've almost lost your life or you have lost the life of a family member, to say, now you should become a civil rights icon and have your, sort of face in the paper.
Jennifer.
That's right. Thank you so much, Jennifer.
Can I just add that I completely understand and agree with what you're saying. And I will also tell you that in the newsrooms in this country, frequently the way to cast Asian Americans is as frightened victims, okay? What I will tell you is that we should all recall the 80-something-year-old granny, the auntie in San Francisco, who was walking down the street when she was attacked by a man, and she picked up a 2x4 and she beat the crap out of him. And the video you saw was him on a gurney being put into an ambulance. Her face was swollen, and she's very actively speaking, right? She's very agitated, but she beat the crap out of this man, an 80-something-year-old woman. Within a few days, a GoFundMe had been started, and more than $1 million was raised in that GoFundMe. And she said, I don't want the money. I want the money to go to the organizations that are going to fight this kind of hatred. Now, how many times since that happened have you seen any news media holding high that video or even searching out other stories where there has been a fight back? And the point that I'm making here is that the narrative of we should be scared, the narrative of Black Black people are coming to get us, right? The narrative, let's remember, right now, more than 37 states, I think it's 37 states in the United States, have either already put in place or are attempting to implement laws that will prevent Chinese from owning land, right? Alien land ownership restrictions. In Texas, where it passed in one house and got defeated because it timed out in the second house, one of the leaders of that anti-alien land movement was Representative Al Green of Houston, African American, who along with the NAACP and other Black people and organizations have paired up with Asian American, Chinese American organizations, including APA Justice, right? This is not new. The NAACP, when Vincent Chin was murdered in Detroit, they were the ones who helped launch and support the Pan-Asian American Civil Rights Movement, right? When Malcolm X was murdered, who cradled his head? These are not new narratives, but they're not often told, nor are they often repeated to show that there has been an historic and continuing relationship. Yes, there are instances of strife and fighting, but there are also many instances of cooperation and collaboration. And that's what the news media, my old profession, does not seem to want to weave into a routine narrative. So it perpetuates a misconception that I think adds to let's draw a circle around Chinatown and keep the Black people out and we'll all be safe. When I stay in New York to visit my hometown, I either stay in a hotel on 124th Street or I stay on Bowery Street in Chinatown. Those are my two communities that I know from childhood and from adulthood.
Right. And, we should acknowledge bridge building is incredibly hard, even among Asian Americans. Asian Americans will divide Japanese, Chinese, Korean, Indian, Pakistani, Filipino, Hmong, Vietnamese. There's no love lost among different Asian immigrant groups. And then even within one, among the Chinese, Mandarin speaking, Cantonese speaking. What do you think about Taiwan or Hong Kong and so on? So there are divisions and divisions and divisions, and bridge building is incredibly hard. It's easy to give a speech and talk about it, and just so hard at the grassroots level to sustain, because it means going places where you might be a little uncomfortable, where people might even be hostile toward you, and rolling up your sleeves and being willing to embrace that discomfort so that you can push through it. And yet I have hope, because some of the rallies that I've gone to, there have been speakers that I've never seen before. White speakers, Black speakers. There was a rally in Queens in downtown Flushing at the height of the pandemic. The then Lieutenant Governor Kathy Hochul was there. Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer was there. The Reverend Al Sharpton was there. And I've never seen so many white and Black and Latino speakers stand in solidarity. That's just the beginning, but we have to nurture this and help sustain it.
Thanks so much for all of those great comments. I feel like we could keep going on this for a long, long time to come, but I just want to make a quick transition. I think there's a couple of really interesting threads that came out of that. I think we've all been touching on it, the idea that sort of course, the Black community and the Asian American community have been malaligned very intentionally by the media and by historical forces. There hasn't been an overt focus on the commonalities and the real affinity that has existed and the sort of joint strife that those communities have been working together throughout history. One other thing that was brought up, and you mentioned this, Jennifer, was the degree of sort of showing up for one another in terms of community. I want to talk a little bit about a different community that is also featured in this series, the Jewish American community. And I think quite unlike the Black American community, there's a real different way in which Asian Americans have been cast alongside Jewish Americans in this country. And I think a lot of it is due, in large part, due to the two groups' kind of distinction and burden of immigrant success. Again, this idea, we keep coming back to the model minority. As you two mentioned, Jennifer, hate crimes are hugely up in this country. Asian American and Jewish American attacks really fueling that spike. And so I want to just play a quick clip of our second episode, which is called A Seat at the Table. It's about an inspiring intersectional community to talk to your point, Paula, around mixed race being the largest demographic in this country, an intersectional community of Asian Jews that's trying to cultivate connection, belonging, and visibility. So we'll go ahead and play that and jump back into the discussion.
I think when people think about commonalities between the Jewish community and the Asian American community, they often lean on model minority tropes like, oh, they're both really into education, and like all these other things that are sometimes true and sometimes very much not.
This really flattens both communities, and the reality within the Asian American community, there's a tremendous diversity.
I think calling Jews or Asian Americans the model minority sets us apart from other minorities in kind of a teacher's pet sort of a way.
It's not a good thing. It's really part of a political strategy to divide communities, to say, if you are quiet and don't speak out, that's what a good minority does. And when you do speak out, when you are vocal, that's being a bad minority.
When I think about the cyclical nature of anti-Semitism and anti-Asian racism, I think the simple answer is just that in both cases we are an easy scapegoat.
I think we're living in a time that's really polarized. I think we're living in a time where things are harder and less predictable. And I think in those moments, people look for folks to blame.
Because we're perceived to be successful or hardworking, these anti-Semitic tropes of control or conspiracy theories manifest. And I see the same thing happening with Asian American communities, especially as the rivalry between the US and China heats up. This sort of xenophobic tradition that our country has had for over 200 years, we see that really bubbling to the surface against both the Asian and Jewish communities right now.
I think both communities are always going to be one national emergency away from being the target of hate in this country. And when I say that, I'm talking about things that happen on the geopolitical level in Asia, things that happen in Israel.
If we want fairness and dignity and respect for one community, we have to fight for fairness, dignity, and respect for all communities.
The fact that the conversation around race is usually black and white, I think means that people are disregarded, that if they don't fit into one camp or the other, that basically their experiences are considered secondary.
In order to achieve the promise of true equality and true equity, we do need different groups to work together in ways that are transformative, that allow us to actually understand our both different and common experiences, to share power, and to ultimately work towards common goals.
So growing up biracial, there's huge potential there for those of us who understand completely what it means to be a part of multiple traditions, to see how well things can come together and see how well things can harmonize.
Thank you so much. So I think, as Vincent Pan put it really, really well, I think in those clips, there's this degree to which communities of color have to work together to fight for each other's collective liberation. And so I'm curious. I'm going to throw this over to you again, Frank. What are some of the ways we've seen and we've heard stories, of course, historically. The brutal killing of Vincent Chin, Malcolm X that you were referring to, Paul, and Yuri Kochiyama, Grace Lee Boggs. But what are some ways you've seen, especially in more recent times, communities coming together to try to address misperceptions, and have they been successful in your view?
Absolutely. Just the Asian American movement itself. My parents weren't Asian American in the sense that they weren't Asian. They didn't embrace a sense of being Asian. And they later in life became American, but originally they didn't perceive of themselves that way. And that's probably true of so many coming, as in Ronald Takaki's words, strangers from a different shore. So I would hold up Asian American itself as a huge success in bridge building, because in Asia, the term Asian is associated with imperialism, right? That's what Japan had during World War II, the East Asia co-prosperity sphere, which was a euphemism for conquest and annexation of its neighbors. So that's an example. The embrace of people of mixed backgrounds, whether they're Blasian, whether they're Asian and Jewish, it is new. It's only within the past generation. There was a time, and change has been so rapid, we sort of forget this, but there was a time when people felt stigma, shame about mixed identity, mixed blood, and they were denigrated or exoticized. Oh, what are you more of, right? And just asked all sorts of inappropriate questions. People who are adoptees, that's another whole community who they may be 100% Asian, but their parents are white and they grow up in families with a different type of experience. All of these are part of the Asian American experience itself, a coalition identity. And we see in all these examples, if you don't know about Malcolm X, just Google it. Grace Lee Boggs, Google as well. So Malcolm X, when he died, he was assassinated in 1965 at the Audubon Ballroom in New York City. The photos in Life magazine show an Asian American woman cradling his head, not a bystander, not a passerby, Yuri Kochiyama, part of his inner circle, because she saw in what he was doing a struggle that brought her in. That cause was her cause. Grace Lee Boggs and James Boggs married radical union organizers in Detroit, my hometown. So this history goes way back. You look at the labor movement, whether it's in Hawaii or elsewhere, there were Latino Asian coalitions. Almost all of this is not talked about, in part because conflict makes for a better news story, right? It's more dramatic. And I would say some of it is deliberate. People don't want to see this possibility. You go back and you look at explicitly white supremacist writing of a century ago. Those books warned of what they called the rising tide of color. And those demagogues said, what is really a problem is if all these minorities get together. But what is happening now, in the words of Gary Okihiro, another historian, is the margins are forming a new mainstream. This is what America looks like now.
Thank you so much, Frank. I want to throw that question to you too, Jennifer. I think just in terms of what you're seeing in your own work, given, of course, as Frank really succinctly put it, the parallel struggles and the history shared by these groups. Are you surprised by the degree of allyship or collaboration between them? You spoke a little bit about folks showing up for each other in the courtroom, but there's a little bit more you might want to add.
I think the issue, and I think Paula mentioned this before, is that given that the rising tide of anti-Asian hate really started in the pandemic in March of 2020 and was fueled by our former president's rhetoric regarding the China virus, there is a perception that Asians stand alone on this issue. I had even heard from South Asian friends that this is not their problem, that this is a problem unique to people who look Chinese, which encompasses Chinese, Korean, Japanese, whatever you might call it. And to Frank's point, obviously, Asians within themselves, there's certainly colorism, right? You see that in every Asian country. And so, there's a perception that this is a uniquely China problem, and that if you're someone who looks potentially Chinese, you're subject to these attacks. But if you don't look somewhat Chinese, that perhaps you're not, if you're South Asian, for example. So I have not seen the degree of allyship that I would have liked to see, to be honest with you. I do think the Black community has come out in support of the Asian community. I want to say that, for example, in Manhattan, where there has been a huge rise of anti-Asian hate, the district attorney is Alvin Bragg, who is a son of Harlem, but who affirmed to me that he would also be a son of Chinatown, which is where his office is near City Hall. And, he has on his advisors many, many Asian people. And the mere fact that his office is in Chinatown, I think bespeaks something. And the head of the hate crimes unit is somebody who is Asian American woman. And, so I think that there are strides being made among people who care about these issues. But I do think that one of the issues that is confronting Asian Americans is a lack of political power. You don't see a lot of Asian Americans coming out to support, kind of the first person on the scene is usually the media and the local elected official. And it's almost always Grace Meng. Representative Grace Meng has shown up repeatedly for every Asian victim, even though most of the Asian victims we represent are in AOC's district. That's a surprising fact for people, but that's the truth, right? And it might be because she has language capabilities. She herself is Chinese, married to someone who's Korean. It might be because she has people on staff who speak the language. But nevertheless, Black representatives have shown up, certainly for the Asians, but it would be good to see more people show up. Chuck Schumer has certainly shown up. But I think that Asians don't perceive that they have political power, and they associate political power with justice. And that's because our district attorneys are elected. And those races are swung by hundreds of votes, not thousands, hundreds. And all of a sudden you see all these Asian people saying, well, how do I vote for the district attorney? We're like, that race just happened. Did anyone vote? And not a single of them have voted for the district attorney. Didn't even know that that was an elected position.
There's also an effort, I'll say something potentially provocative. There's an effort to enlist Asian Americans politically to attack the causes of civil rights. There are some folks out there who want to encourage division. They promote the model minority myth. They want to get close to Asian Americans. And the narrative that they have is, hey, we're on your side, Asian Americans, and there's a subtle or not too subtle message. Come to this side and let's not embrace African Americans and the civil rights movement. And instead, let's denigrate blacks either explicitly or implicitly. And that's a real problem because it just adds to this tension. There's underlying tension, but there are folks who want to add to it, who just want to ratchet it up.
Absolutely. And I just want to be clear that the victims don't always know the difference, right? So one of the victims said, if all the Asian Americans have given me $1 million in GoFundMe, why wouldn't the $250,000 bail that was set for defendant, who's black in that instance, why wouldn't he be able to raise that much from the black community? There's a tribalism aspect to this that we can't, kind of undo, and that, the victims are easily persuaded that America votes by color. And if that's not to be true, then it's up to the community to come out and say that.
I think to your point, Frank, I think what we're seeing in the affirmative action debate right now very much kind of fits that narrative a little bit. It's just the idea of trying to recruit Asian Americans to fight on the side, that is, supposedly about their own kind of empowerment and their own willingness to get into college, but of course is kind of then sending them apart and sending as a wedge between other communities of color. So I think this is a playbook that folks have been using for a long time now. And I want to ask you, Paula, about this. I'm sure you have a lot of thoughts on a number of the things that have come up here, but someone who yourself, you're often described as the conductor of the symphony, someone who really straddles multiple communities, as you've mentioned as well in your remarks. What are some of the successes you've seen as someone who has brought people together across the aisle, and also maybe some of the challenges?
Sure. Well, I would like to incorporate some thoughts coming out of the comments that were just made. So that, for example, if I go back to those states where the alien restrictive land ownership laws have been passed, which, by the way, are unconstitutional, and there is a lawsuit that has been filed. But if I go back to that, the analysis shows that the states where those passed sort of under the cover of silence. People weren't aware that this was going on. By people, I mean people to whom this matters, right? It happened in states where there were no AAPI elected officials in the Senate or the House of those state houses, of those states. So what we know is that if Asian Americans aren't empowered and have a voice, then who will speak out? Well, here's the other interesting fact. In the instances where there were no Asian Americans and these laws were opposed, it was almost always African American elected officials who spoke out. Why? Because African Americans recognize when the incursion, the limitation on civil rights is happening, and we know if it happens, one iota, it's going to grow, and it won't be restricted to any one group. I'd also like to, just for a moment, address the partisan political part of this. If it means that in order for you to buy a home in a state, that you have to present your passport, that will apply to people whether they vote Democratic or whether they vote Republican or don't vote at all. So this is an issue that I believe not only takes us back to the days of the Chinese Exclusion Acts, which, by the way, didn't matter. It did not matter whether you were lower class, middle class, upper class economically. And the other thing is how many people in these United States and many countries, by the way, can tell the difference by glancing across the room. Oh, is that person Chinese or Japanese or Vietnamese or Korean or Hmong or Thai? And when we talk about South Asians, remember we saw Sikhs attacked when we were going through the issue about Muslim terrorists. There's no way to cut and slice your own particular silo into one of a protected class. It's not going to happen. So we either all stand up in the name of democracy and support and civil rights for all, or we watch the whole thing crumble. Because what you can't do is fight for civil rights for just those 10 people, and we don't care about everybody else. I think this will largely come about, the changes will come about through education. And by education, I mean teaching our recent immigrant communities and others why it is important to vote. Recognizing that in many instances, the countries from which they have come, that's seen as an already corrupted system. And the narrative among some people here in this country is they are trying to prove, in big quotes, that this system is corrupt, that you can't count on what the voting machines will tell you. The entire concept here is one of fear and hatred and division, right? And what I want to tell you that as a former working journalist, my attack on that whole propaganda is, I would say almost 40 years ago in Dallas, Texas, where I was living, I and some colleagues who were working journalists created a seminar named this, How to Get into the News Without Committing Murder, a seminar on Black access to the media. I am doing the same thing now and substituting Black for Asian American. I am bringing together, as best I can, colleagues who are former working journalists, and we are teaching community people, not all just leaders, but leaders too, because the scientists we've seen from the China Initiative certainly are under attack. Even Sherry Chen, who worked for the National Weather Service, was dragged out of her office in handcuffs. Right? So who's protected? Particularly when we're teaching people from the Asian community, keep quiet. Don't speak to the cameras, right? Don't talk. But if we don't talk, then we don't control the narrative. As a former working journalist, I have taken it on as a responsibility and a role to teach people who are disenfranchised and who do not have the knowledge. It's my responsibility to give them the knowledge about how to speak to the media and how to use the time, especially when there's a live newscast going on. Is that the best time to hold a protest rally? Probably. On a noon newscast when there's very little else going on except an accident, right? Or someone surfing on the beach, maybe a rally where they're protesting restrictive land ownership rights might get covered live. These are things that insiders will know, that I see as a former insider. It's my responsibility to teach my communities in total. Black community, Asian community, teach them how the media works and how to make it work for you.
Thank you so much, Paula. And I think you brought up a really interesting point too, is about if we want to encourage coalition building going forward, one really salient way to do that is encouraging folks to vote. And I think one of the questions that came in around that sort of topic is, how can we engage and encourage current and future generations to think about solidarity and coalition building, especially coming from an educational perspective, something that you talked about a little bit, Frank. So I want to just ask Frank and Jennifer, we'll just in the 4 minutes we've got left, a lightning round. Just from your perspective, what are some ways in which we can encourage that kind of coalition building in the future?
So my number one thing is social media. That social media now allows people to go to places like Parler, where you can just have an echo chamber of your own views. If we want to come together, we have to see hate that an attack on one is an attack on all. And that is the definition of a hate crime. Attack on one is attack on all. But if we don't limit hate speech on social media, which I know is controversial given First Amendment rights, what you see happening is echo chambers where an attack on one is just an attack on one. And it used to be that if you committed hate speech or, you attacked one person, you'd be ostracized from the community. No one else would talk to you. But now people have found like-minded people where it's an echo chamber. And so I believe the next kind of frontier of this is how to regulate hate speech or to eliminate hate speech where people aren't kind of just getting reinforced in their beliefs.
I love that, Jennifer. Thank you. And Frank, you got the last word.
Yeah, what's most important is to show up and to keep showing up. People want to know, how do we get power? And the answer is you show up. Most people don't show up. And if you show up at a nonprofit, a community meeting, at a civic association, if you show up 3 times in a row, they're going to put you on the board. If you go to 3 board meetings, you're going to be the president next year, and you're going to be the president until someone else shows up 3 times. Most people don't show up, and showing up just by yourself, you can sit quietly. If you are just there consistently, people get to know you, and suddenly you're in the movement, whether you want to be or not. And you don't have to be the loudest person. You don't have to be the wealthiest person. You just have to be there and participate. That's what it's all about. Just like democracy, diversity is a process. It's about civic engagement and getting involved.
Beautiful. I love that, Frank. A good rallying cry, I think, for all of us and for our audience tonight. I just want to thank you all so very much, Paula, Frank, Jennifer, for being here. This has been an absolutely enlightening and really fascinating discussion. I hope you all enjoyed it as much as I did. And thank you to Exploring Hate. Thank you to the Serica Initiatives for this wonderful partnership. And we have these 3 incredible episodes for this film series that really engage with this topic in really interesting and deep ways. So for folks who want to see, the full episodes are streaming absolutely for free online in their entirety, pbs.org/WNET/Exploring Hate. I hope you all check them out. Thank you all again so much for being here with us this evening, and hope you have a wonderful rest of your day.
Thank you.
Thank you all.